Maybe what I'll do is tap dance here in the corner for a moment and just introduce all three of our participants. This session, because of David's time constraint, was going to work a little bit differently in that we would have David's talk first and a bit of conversation about it, and then we would hear talks from Emily and Brooke, both of whom worked very directly with Murray Schafer in composition and performance projects. So I'm really excited to have you both here today. Um, and here's David. Look at that. Internet tap dancing works every time. Okay, so David, I'm going to make you a co-host. And you should now be able to turn on your camera and say hello.
Hello, where's my camera?
There you are. No, I still don't see you.
Sometimes the camera is not happy when you come on, it was there. Okay.
There you are. Okay, great. Well, welcome and thanks so much for joining us. So we're going to start with your presentation. We're delighted to have David with us. He's a professor of philosophy and music at the New Jersey Institute of Technology in the US. And he's really a wonderful clarinetist with a long engagement of making music in interspecies connection. So, David, this session is called Composing and Performing with Nature, and we'll hear your talk first and take some questions after it. We know you have a time constraint.
Yeah, I'm sorry. They scheduled some meeting in my department right now online at the same time. So I just left it in the middle of an argument to come talk to you, which is a lot more fun. And I'm just going to speak for 10 minutes. It's great to see all of you here and really think about the influence of Murray Schafer on all of us. He had a huge influence on me and my interest in all these things, which started when I was I met him in 1991 at the Banff Center for the Arts when I was there on a residency that was called the Bioapparatus. And Michael Century invited me for dinner with Murray Schafer. I'd been pouring through the library in Banff, all these things he did. This guy was putting on these performances in the wilderness. He wrote all these books. He seemed to publish them all himself. He was doing it all. And then they were planning his 60th birthday celebration, which was going to be in 1993. And he started talking about, and we went driving around. We went to the place where he had put on this wilderness lake performance where he said some people just were on the highway and they followed the traffic and ended up there. They were just trying to get to Vancouver and ended up in the performance. And then at that conference in 1993, that was a real moment when I just met all these people. That's when I realized there was a community. Wasn't this huge one that we have now, but there were these people all over the world interested in soundscape from different points of view. And I met so many people that changed the trajectory of my life at that event. And as we've talked so far, Murray Schafer was controversial, cranky. He liked to provoke people. He really didn't like noise. And we know a lot of us love noise because so much cool music is made out of noise. He had very ideological ideas. This was a good soundscape. This was a bad one. Mostly the bad ones involve people in the modern world with our sounds. Now we're in the world where you take these beautiful natural sounds and turn them into noise, and people make music out of that. And so the borders have gone away. But I think we forget that the best, most important contribution of Murray Schafer is to bring people together and get many people into this whole movement. All of us who are here, so many other people, he kind of brought people together. And I think that's an important thing to recognize, that in this field, you can have a clear vision, so clear a vision that he did. He didn't just keep it to himself, didn't just do everything his own way. Sometimes he did, but he really wanted people together to explore this area. But I'd like to throw a question out to people for a little discussion in the time that I'm able to stay here is, what do you think about this idea that this guy said noise is bad? It's just a bad thing. We have to fight against it. And yet so many people who influenced by him love noise, turn it into music, and even are quite interested in this kind of hybrid soundscapes in between humanity and nature. You know, for all the talk of how hard it is to find a pristine place where no human sounds interrupt, I've for over time found myself more and more interested in hybrid soundscapes where human sounds and natural sounds are together. That's why I went, you know, spent so much time in Berlin making music with nightingales rather than going deep into the wilderness to do that, because you have people and birds and music and noise and parties and wildness all in one place. And unless we can put human sounds, human life together with nature, there's no hope for us. We should just go away. There should be no people and let natural sounds just prevail without us. The only way we as humans can be part of this whole world of stuff is if we can be together with these natural sounds, and you can't oppose the noise of the modern world. And the sense of music that's now expanded, you can't oppose that to the wonderful world of nature that Murray Schafer turned us on to. And it's great that we have so many different voices, and we recognize today how many perspectives were left out of this vision that Schafer and those of his generation put forth. I think the most important thing is to have these new voices, not just critique and say, no, 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 but say, yes, look how beautiful this way of hearing the world is that we overlook because we didn't ask these people what they thought. So I guess I'd like to throw this out to the group for the next few minutes. We can talk about it. How much do you think that we should get beyond the critique that some kinds of sounds are bad in favor of the world we have today? As people get much more familiar with these technologies, everyone can use them. We have phones that can record sounds. We can train ourselves to listen. We can put on headphones, crank up the microphone, intensify the sounds around us. How much do we need to work to make it all more interesting and more attractive as a thing to do? Or should we still be pushing this critique idea? We've got to change our sounds because they're bad. So what do you think?
So David's asked a good provocative question and a very Schaferian one. So again, I would invite folks to type in the chat or to put your hand up in the reactions so that we can recognize you and you can speak. I don't know if you're monitoring the chat, David, but so far we have.
And people are mentioning John Cage. He was a wonderfully warm, open, welcoming person, but he was extremely opinionated. He said, free yourself from your likes and dislikes, but there's so much that he disliked that he loved talking about. He's a good example of this paradox because he was so opinionated, but kind of welcomed chance into this in a paradoxical way that I don't think everyone's really investigated.
Maybe as we're waiting for people to kind of chew on this, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your perspective, David, of this in terms of your own aesthetics, of your own performances with nightingales in an urban environment or with whales, including the sounds of the boat and the human kind of presence there in the water. What's your own take on this? Because you've really done a lot of work.
I was trying to learn from the sounds around. I try and learn from the places I am. I think about that conference because I just turned 60. I had my own small music festival for my 60th birthday. And I thought that, okay, how does it feel to be as old as Murray Schafer was when I first met him? First, I thought, boy, he seemed really old. Like, I'm that old now. I have to be like that. And then I also think that the most positive thing is when I started doing this stuff, I really was more self-involved. I saw myself as like this heroic figure going out and doing these adventurous things. And now I'm most interested in getting other people involved. Like, let's get as many people as possible to get together, see what happens. Like it seems more interesting to have it not just be me. And in fact, the notion of, when we made this Nightingales in Berlin film, I really wanted to film people playing music with birds for the first time. How did it sound when people did this? There's these wonderful moments that you sort of watch others getting transformed. And that kind of really interested me more and more.
Okay. There's a couple of interesting comments in the chat. Santiago Ranteria says we need a multi-species understanding of noise. And Garth Payne says, what is noise, though? It is a word that is used more in a derogatory sense, one of judgment. I like to think of the sounds as an ecology and not as binaries of included, excluded.
Yeah, I think Garth is right. And so is Santiago as well, like, what do we want this word to mean? Some people use it as a sound they don't like. Other people use it for a sound they can't categorize. I don't know what it is. Like if they're talking about music, you're working with electronic music, certain sounds you use are called noise because they don't fit into these tonal qualities. I feel like it's both things. We can't decide what a word means the way people use it. We have to recognize how it's used. And that I think you can definitely show people so easily today the musical possibilities of a sound they previously don't think is interesting. And you can, but somebody earlier today, I think maybe it was John Draver, who said, like, boy, I thought I was a good listener, but I went and talked to people. They knew so much more than me. Like, we talk about listening, but are we actually good at it? And I think it's important to recognize for all of us that the moments when we learn to listen better, when did we get better at it?
Oh.
Like, in playing with these, sorry to go on, but playing with these nightingales in Berlin, you get to recognize individual birds. They come back every year to the same tree for like 6 or 7 years. Certain ones are more interested in this musical interaction, and they're like better singers according to my characteristic of like hearing interesting things. And you find others are not interested, others do different things. You really sense these differences, and until you spend time doing this, you wouldn't notice any of that. It would just all sound the same.
Yeah. As Emily Doolittle has said in a direct message, Emily, your messages still aren't going to everyone in the chat. She says, I don't think there's actually such a thing as noise. It depends on context and perception. And that sounds, you're also talking about this like decoupling valuation from particular sounds, the aesthetic of particular sounds.
If somebody doesn't like it, they're going to say it's noise.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Consider that as music, and then you have a different view.
I've always wanted to ask you about how you think of the agency of the animals that are responding to your music. I remember giving a talk once in which I played a recording of the flute piece that Murray wrote for me that's meant to be played at dawn, and there were lots of birds responding, and somebody in the audience said, well, those birds aren't enjoying what you're doing. They're angry. You've interrupted their habitat, and they're reacting in a territorial way. So I wonder about your take on that. Are your sounds noise to other animals, and how would you know?
Well, whoever said that, why do they think they're correct? Their opinion. Of course, if you ask scientists what are birds doing at dawn, they used to think that every bird was just listening to others of its own species and ignoring everything else. But in recent years, that view seems to be changing. And we're recognizing through our better understanding of the dawn chorus that all these species listen to each other, and they are aware of all these things, and they're not just against it. It's like they're part of this whole soundscape. We don't know what they're thinking exactly, although people do try and do studies of that. I certainly, if I found that some animal didn't like what I was doing, I'll stop, And I've certainly run across people who've kicked my microphones, said, we're calling the police, you're ruining our bird, sometimes.
Wow.
Or people are more supportive. Sometimes the police say, you got to stop, people are complaining, but other times the police say, this is really interesting. We want to make sure no one's bothering you. This is really important what you're doing. It depends on the people and the situation. But I would say, I'm much more interested in playing live with all these sounds than playing with them in the studio, which of course is so fun. You can do anything. But if you're live, you don't know what's going to happen. You're in this new situation. Recently, I did something with the next project I'm doing is about underwater pond sounds. Which is a good thing to do during the pandemic. You can't travel anywhere, so you can walk into the woods until you find a pond, stick a hydrophone down, and it sounds like crazy electronic music right away. You're not doing anything. What's going on? Turns out we really don't know what most of those sounds are. Many are made by plants, some by insects, maybe fish, turtles. It's surprisingly not so well studied. Need to find. But, I did an event at the Rockefeller Preserve, not so far from here. And they said, it's an all ages event. A lot of little kids will be there. They don't have any patience. You got to do something in 10 minutes and then go on to the next thing. They're going to want to leave. I said, well, you might have to listen for an hour or more before anything happens in this pond. So we did this. all the kids wanted to stay, all the parents wanted to leave. And we stayed, and actually, just like I thought might happen, after more than an hour, the sound suddenly changed, just like I said it might, and everyone was really excited. And there were even some 8-year-olds who were fishing creatures out of the pond, looking them up on their phone and telling me what they were when I was wrong, you know. Like I was talking about a water scorpion, which is a really crazy sound that I've heard, but I've never actually seen one. And so we fished something out. It looked like a dragonfly larva to me. And this 8-year-old said, "No, this is a water scorpion. Look." I looked it up. I have an app. It's like, yeah, you're right. Good for you. So they had incredible patience in wanting to find out more, you know, which is something Schafer probably would have liked. He probably would have liked that story with all of his examples.
I bet he would. But a thing that you're kind of pinging for me with this is, again, this entanglement of technology with listening and with this kind of ways of knowing in an interspecies or more broadly ecological environment. And I wonder what you think about that mediation of technology in the work. I mean, you've characterized it in a very positive way just now.
Yeah, this is something that always interested me. It's what my PhD thesis was about. Because before working on my philosophy PhD, I was working with Arne Næss in Norway and hanging out with these radical environmentalists. They said, like, end to the modern world. Let's go live in these huts high in the mountains and just hunt our local food and stuff. And they were very down on technology. But I sort of thought that technology can sometimes bring us closer to nature, like microscopes, telescopes, and listening and recording. And many of us love using these technologies, but, you know, at the same time, we all want to throw them away. Like, just go out and just listen, use our own body and mind and senses as they are. So I think the best technologies humans have made are those that extend our senses.
The clarinet is such a technology.
We hope sometimes, right? And also, you know, the best things about, you know, when I go out and record these pond sounds, I stick speakers out so everyone can hear them. It might mess up, there might be some feedback, it might mess up the purity of the recording, but it's boring just to wear headphones, only you're hearing it. And sometimes I put like 10 Bluetooth speakers out with different hydrophones around a pond, so you make it come to life and just listen to it. And that's like, you know, you're hearing things that are there that otherwise we miss, which I kind of like. You know, everyone's obsessed with all kinds of cameras and visual things because we're so visual. But the same thing with listening has enabled, you know, why is the best collection of bird songs now Xenocanto, an open source website started in Latin America where anyone can upload sounds. It's way better than what Cornell has, the British Library. People doing their own recordings, I would argue, is far superior than the official places that have the fancy because people are in places where they hear things you're going to miss because there's so much going on. And so, you know, spending all day on technology is not healthy for you. You got to go outside, you know, and you've got to, but if technologies you can take outside, they can be part of your outside life, you know. And so I think it is worth thinking about this, but all you know, musical instruments are technologies. They're like some of the best things. They extend things. Recently, I was in Paris trying out these fancy clarinets that cost huge amounts of money. And I was thinking, like, it's interesting to play these things to be one of, like, you know, fewer people can appreciate this. Like, you can tell there's something special about this instrument that I'm not going to buy because it's so expensive. But it's interesting to have been trained with this technology to be able to hear what's going on here.
Yeah. It's an interesting thought also about the kind of instrument that is fit for purpose for environmental playing. You know, I when I worked with Schafer, I used to have this kind of budget for repairs because the flute's not really very good outdoors in the rain, and you know, so there's something about having an instrument that you're not so precious with that you feel like you can take on a boat or, you know, in the mist and play.
Yeah, I think I take 2 nice clarinets out. I do. I try not to take the nicest ones out on salt water, but I take it out other places. And I see when I was out with Matthew Barley playing with nightingales in England, he had some incredibly valuable cello that was outside in the rain. He didn't care. He just brought it out there. I said, "You're bringing that cello?" Because yeah, it's fine.
Ah,
So sometimes people think it's more important to get the music out there than to protect your precious things. So, but yeah, I think that it's I go back and forth about all these things. Lately, I've gotten more interested in putting on whole concerts outside. I guess inspired by Schafer. So I'll bring some electronic instruments like an iPad and play it with another speaker and listen to the ponds. And although I'm not sure it's actually possible, I really think these pond creatures respond to things that I'm playing above water. I haven't been proving it in a scientific way, but they're really loud. Some of these water bugs are extremely loud, almost as loud as whales in the springtime. They can be so loud that you think something's wrong with your equipment. All of a sudden you hear this sound. A fact well documented.
that sounds like an amazing project.
Right, and so it's also not that hard to hear these things. They're just around.
David,
So,
I
yeah,
want to.
I don't want to take more time. I'm gonna stick around a little bit to hear the next person. I'm so sorry that I can't stay as long as I wanted to, but I've been here all morning until now.
Yeah, I'm really, really glad to hear
So
that.
thanks so much for doing this. What a great
Okay. Oh, pleasure. We do have a quick question, perhaps from Glenn Whitehead, who asks, "Does your experience improvising with nature feel similar to improvising with humans?"
It definitely affects how I improvise with humans, and that it depends. To some humans, someone you can't talk to from another part of the world is making some sounds. Maybe you don't know what they're doing. You really don't know their music. It can be similar, but there's something wonderful about music that we don't know how it works. We don't really know what it means. It can communicate across cultures. So why not across species? So many human languages describe certain sounds of birds and bugs as songs. We recognize there's something musical about that all over the world. And what that is something about the performing these like rituals, these pattern sounds over and over and over again, rather than saying something that you want to translate. There's something about this sounds made by these creatures that we see as performances. We hear them as performances. They have to keep going and going and going. And if it's music, we can get it without trying to translate it.
Thank you so much. I'm going to remove the spotlight on you and put it on to Emily. If you can turn your camera on, please, Emily. There you are. Okay, so I'm gonna introduce both Emily and Brooke Dufton, who are our next two speakers, and we'll hear these two papers and then or present provocations, and then we'll have some time for discussion before lunch. So Emily Doolittle is an Athenaeum Research Fellow and lecturer in composition at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. She's a composer and well-rounded musician, and really a pioneer in the field of zoo musicology. And Brooke Dufton has the DMA from the Faculty of Music at University of Toronto. She's a vocalist and voice teacher. She is an expert interpreter of R. Murray Schafer's vocal music. And in fact, Schafer's widow, Eleanor James, told me that she considers Brooke to be the definitive interpreter of Schafer's environmental musical works quite recently. So we're delighted to have you both here. Please go ahead, Emily.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for having me here and for all the great papers so far today. I don't know who I would be as a musician without my interactions with Murray Schafer as a composer, thinker, and person from when I was a teenager onwards. I first encountered his music in school choir. We sang Epitaph for Moonlight with its beautifully notated score and magical vocal sounds, the likes of which I had never heard before. I loved the music, both the sounds and the score itself. But even more, I loved that he took us seriously as music makers, even though we weren't professionals, even though we were children. While still in high school, I read his books. I was greatly inspired by his ideas about music education and about the soundscape. More problematically, I was also intrigued by his ideas about what it is to be Canadian and to be a Canadian artist. Even as a teenager, I found some of his ideas troublesome, but I did not know how to sort through or contextualize them. Towards the end of my time in high school, I heard a performance of his third string quartet at Scotia Festival. It was one of the most incredible pieces and performances I had ever heard. The entire audience leapt to their feet at the end. I knew then and there that I had to be a musician. Not long after that, I attended Music for Wilderness Lake, an overnight set of dawn and dusk performances at Camp Kidston in Nova Scotia, also presented by Scotia Festival. And it was my first experience of outdoor music, not of bringing music intended for indoor performance outdoors. I had always hated that, but of hearing music made for outdoor performance, with the natural world an equal participant in its creation. I was hooked. When I found out about Schafer's then new collaborative project, And Wolf Shall Inherit the Moon, taking place for a week every summer at Halliburton Forest in Ontario, I knew I needed to join. I wrote a letter to Murray and received a positive, welcoming response. I was 20 then, and for the next 10 years, for the entirety of my 20s, attending the Wolf Project was the centerpiece of my summers. As you can imagine, the years between 20 and 30 are often very formative for composers, and it is hard for me to imagine who I would be as a composer in person without my time at Wolf. The summer I was 30, I couldn't go to the Wolf Project for logistical reasons. And after that, I found myself unable to go back at all. In part, I had learned more about the problematic aspects of cultural appropriation. I had more questions than answers, but I knew I needed to take some time to think about what is mutual sharing, what is being respectfully and appropriately influenced, and what is outright stealing. I also realized that I was relying too heavily on the Wolf Project to provide a kind of artistic, communal, and perhaps spiritual experience that I craved. I needed to figure out who I was without it. As artists, we can tell many overlapping, intertwining, or conflicting stories about our artistic trajectory. I think one story I could tell about my own life, certainly not the only one, but a valid one, is that since leaving Wolf, my entire musical and academic career has been about following up threads started at Wolf, about building on ways of art making that I first encountered there, and about piecing together the bits and pieces of things I lost when I left. Since Schafer and Wolf were so influential for me during my formative years, I don't even know how to sort out entirely what is me and what is Wolf, but I'd like to mention a few of the things that were important to me about participating in the Wolf Project and how I've tried to find some of these things outside of Wolf. The first is actually not musical or artistic at all, at least not directly. It was a sense of being part of a community, of a group of people who were in community with each other year after year, beyond individual friendships or the usual separations between work, play, art, and home. We were and had to be there for and with each other in a way that was new to me at the time. I had experienced community in daily life and community in creating art, but never previously the intertwining of the two. 20 years later, I still think of Wolf people as my people, even people who joined after I left. Out of this, of course, grew kinds of art making that were worlds apart from my usual experience as a classically trained musician. Working closely with a small group of people, day in and day out, cooking breakfast and making trails through the forest, as well as collaborating artistically, you become curious about what each person can offer, whether they are professional or amateur, have a lifetime of experience, or are just beginning to find their voice. You come to value intent, learning, and courage every bit as much as polish or show. You come to learn that informal ways of sharing art, perhaps a story around a campfire or a spontaneous poem at breakfast, can be just as meaningful as an elaborately rehearsed performance. You come to realize that a tiny piece of music, a chant or a lullaby, perhaps sung by a child, can be as powerful as the grandest symphony. One of the passages of Murray's writing that has always stuck with me is this from Patria in the Theatre of Confluence. What is the purpose of art? First, exaltation. Let us speak of that. The change that occurs when we are lifted out of the tight little cages of our daily realities, of the newness that stuns the mind and sends it reeling. And if we return to our daily routines, they are no longer routines, but scintillate and have become magnificent by our sensing them with fresh eyes and noses and minds and bodies. This must be the first purpose of art, to effect a change in our existential condition. I like how he talks about escaping the realm of the mundane, but then necessarily coming back to it too, with new eyes, ears, and hearts. I feel like this was played out daily at the Wolf Project, the rituals of taking care of ourselves and each other, deepening the meaning of the art we collectively created, and the art, in turn, giving meaning to the tasks of daily life. I've never experienced quite the same thing elsewhere, though the summer I spent volunteering at Bread and Puppet had similar aspects of communal art making. I also think a lot about the cyclical nature of art making at Wolf. Though some stories or performances took place only once, others were repeated on a daily or weekly or yearly basis. What does it mean to return daily or weekly or yearly to the same art, letting it develop and grow as a living practice? One of the most moving performances I've seen recently was nominally a children's show, Puppet State Theater performing an adaptation of The Man Who Planted Trees by Jean Journeau, which they have been doing since 2006. What does it mean for artists to devote themselves to the continual and ever-changing renewal of an artistic work, just as the man in The Man Who Planted Trees devoted himself to continually planting trees? There's so much I could talk about in relation to Murray and the Wolf Project, but I'd like to end by talking about the relationship between Wolf and the natural world. As I mentioned before, when I was a teenager, I had always hated the outdoor concerts I was part of, like when we performed standard classical repertoire outdoors in youth orchestra. A Beethoven symphony is not enhanced by having to bat away flies and chase music that is blown off the stand. But at Wolf, I experienced a whole new way of making music outdoors, a way that involved a lot more listening, adapting, and interacting. I let go of my sense that I needed to control everything, whether as an oboist or as a composer, and my music making became more flexible and permeable. Hours spent listening in the woods led to greater curiosity about the non-human life around me. Birds, in particular, became central to my music and academic practice. Many of my pieces are based in some way on birdsong, and much of my academic research is about how we hear and understand birdsong. I moved to Scotland 7 years ago, and one of the reasons I was drawn to moving here is that there is a large and very active arts and environment community. In Canada, Schafer was and is such a powerful influence, and it's been so helpful and important for me to rethink my relationship to the environment in new contexts. There are hugely inspiring festivals like the Environmental Arts Festival, and artists like Hannah Tuliki, Sarah Hopfinger, Minty Donald, and Dee Hedden doing incredible outdoor and environment-related work, as well as a long-standing and active tradition of Gaelic music and folklore related to the environment. I'm still working through this, but a huge difference that I feel since moving here is that in Canada, it often seemed like cities and the natural worlds were at odds. You might pack a car with expensive equipment, buy some backcountry permits, drive for 10 hours, and head off into the woods for 2 weeks, carrying everything you need in your back, maybe hoping to see no other people at all. Of course, it is not true that Canadian wildland is or was completely untouched by people, but settler mythology told us it was so. Whereas here, there is no way of denying the thousands of years of human history that have taken place. You can see traces of it everywhere, even in the wildest areas. Likewise, people interact differently with urban land here, foraging, building campfires, building shelters in parks right in the middle of the city. As a Canadian, I had thought that these activities needed to be reserved for the wilderness. Yet this actually makes me feel more connected to the natural world, not less. I know I can step out of my front door in the middle of Glasgow, walk along paths that have been used for millennia until I end up in the Highlands. Along the way, I can stay in centuries-old inns or camp wherever I like. I'm looking forward to seeing how this new way of relating to the natural world and being part of this new artistic community will continue to unfold in my music. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A lot of memories resonating for me there in what you have to say, Emily. We'll move on to Brooke Dufton. I think these are two talks that are very well connected, and Brooke will ask you to turn your camera on, and I will spotlight you. There we are. And if you do want to share your screen, you are able to do so.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me today, Ellen, and thank you to David and Emily for those inspiring talks. Thank you. They relate very closely to what I'm speaking about today. I am a soprano, and I've been working on Schafer's music, amongst other things, for the last 20 plus years. I've sung them outdoors in their original contexts, and I've also performed them indoors in concerts organized by Schafer or by others, but with his consent. I've been participant in various Patria projects and have also performed his music in concert, both on stage and in these outdoor performances. So I will be speaking from my position as a performer, and what I'm hoping to do today is share with you how the performance and the preparation of these pieces differs from traditional standard classical vocal rep. I think Schafer's music and its intended performance context offer a possibility for distinctive experiences for the performer, and also for a new positioning of the performer in relation to their performance space, whether it's outdoors or in a concert hall. Okay, so I'll show you some stages. So first we have what we think of as the traditional concert hall experience, the concert stage. This happens to be one at a university setting. But you can see the centering of the performers. Visibly, they are highly lit and everyone is sitting in a circle around them. In addition, we have acoustic support. The concert hall has been designed to focus attention on their sound and to reproduce that sound so that the concert attendees will hear the same quality, ideally reproducible every time. So it should be perfect, or should be transparent. The concert hall shouldn't affect our hearing of the music, if possible. So that's the traditional design. You can also see behind these doors is a very comfortable green room. So that is where we can retreat to get rest, to get water, stay comfortable, and be invisible and protected. And then we have Schafer's stages. So you should be able to see here a beautiful picture of Two Jack Lake in Banff. This is where Princess of the Stars occurred, and the Sun, Father, Earth, Mother cycle was partly composed for this space, as well as for a place in Switzerland, St. Gallen, with these beautiful mountain lakes. This is a lake in Halliburton. Beaver Lake is what we call it. It's a location we use in the Wolf Project, which is where a lot of this music was inspired by and is frequently performed. So you can see, just even looking at these two stages, not only are they not concert halls and the performer will be invisible in the grand scale of things. We have this massive mountain, this massive lake, and she, the soprano, would be somewhere at the back in that forest, about 1 kilometer away from the audience. Here, it's a much, much smaller lake. The same pieces will be performed in that space. We don't have the mountains, so the acoustic personality of this space will be dramatically different, despite the fact that it is still an outdoor lake, which is what it's for, right? This generic idea of lake acoustic. The same piece that's written for this lake is considered to be written for this lake. All right. So as I work, I try to move from space to space and investigate that space and alter my, not my pitches necessarily, but my timbre, my rhythmic pacing, my speed, the direction of my face. I change my piece, the materials of my piece, to explore and perhaps exploit the potentials of each acoustic location. So, how I go about it. So I like to go a few days in advance or the day before, so that I can start to make some interpretive decisions based on that location. This is not something we are conventionally trained to do as singers, but I was a member of the Wolf Project from the 90s, and I learned through exposure and experience there, which was very playful and non-judgmental. I learned about some of the potentials of these spaces, and I loved it. I loved it, and have taken that out into my concert work. So there are some musical elements and some non-standard aesthetic values to consider when I'm making these interpretive decisions, no matter what context you're in. It includes an embracing of distant learning or distant listening, distant learning, post-COVID slip. Distant listening and 360-degree listening, or listening from a variety of angles. So in the concert hall setting, we had the stage And they were in front of the audience. The performers were in front of the audience, and the listeners listened like this, picking up maybe some reflections, but the dominant sound was direct. And that's the design of the concert hall. Schafer was hoping in these stages to encourage a variety of listening experiences for his audiences, and I would say for the performer as well. There's also a preference in these pieces for reverberant components of sound. So that direct component is often intentionally minimized so that we hear echoes and reverberations more dominantly. So yes, every lake is different. And the lakes are different not only for their geographical factors, like the mountains, but also because of the time of day of your performance or the weather. Dawn and dusk are excellent conditions on a lake for experiencing the aesthetic ideals that Schafer has cooked into his repertoire. And mist is wonderful, wind is bad. So there are distinct ideals and aesthetic values imposed upon these pieces. After learning my notes, I go out into the space, and I ideally have a listener with me because my position is usually quite different from the audience's position, and it's very challenging to understand their experience. And as much as I am enjoying this for myself, and I am, the goal is to create an experience for the listener. So I bring a listener with me in the best case scenario, and I experiment with how the sound reaches them and get their feedback and make adjustments. I also learn the effects of directing my sound differently. So I can sing in one direction and find out that there's a little bay, and that bay makes a really cool little cycling loop. And so if I have something fast, I can sing that towards the bay, and it might actually make a little, almost like slightly choral arrangement. I can move my head as I sing. So the direction of my focus will have a large impact on both what they hear and how the sounds interact with each other. That's a delightful experience. I so love this entire process of investigating the space and seeing what my sound what happens when my sound is released into this space. Sometimes I can sing a glissando, for example, and as I'm singing this glissando, if I'm moving, it's all happening somewhat at the same time, and we get this quality. So those are just some examples of the way I choose to play. I can also learn the effects of the acoustic on pacing. The pacing of Schafer's scores, he's very spacious in the outdoor music. Although there were free components and flexible components in his concert hall music, this not to the same degree. It's greatly expanded in his outdoor works with the intention of not only giving the performers, especially an ensemble, flexibility to accommodate these larger spaces and the acoustic reverb and time that it takes for the sound to travel, but also because we are working to integrate the performer with the space. By taking my time and slowing down, I have the opportunity to hear not only how my sound is echoing in space, but who is echoing with me, or what other sounds are present. One of Schafer's goals with these pieces is to create a more engaged, deeper connection with nature and with the environment and with listening. So these things are all brought together beautifully in these pieces. If you allow yourself to slow down and fill those, instead of filling the world with your sound, you take the time to listen and see what sounds are there and allow those sounds to influence your next gesture. The sounds and the sights as well of your environment inform your interpretation in the moment. So if I have sung and wolves or coyotes perhaps have responded with howling, had I gone right from my first gesture to my second gesture, I may not have heard them. I may have discouraged them. The sounds would have been perhaps conflicting, but because I sang my first gesture and waited and listened, there was time for my sound to reach the coyotes or the wolves, hopefully, and then them to generate a sound, and for that sound to return to me. And from that sound, I gave it even more space because it was astounding, right? So, and then the next thing I sang, I know to be reaching this other set of animals. It's quite a thrilling duet. Another example would be using pacing to use my sound to interact, as I spoke about earlier. One example is with the loon song that's written into Ariadne's aria. She's making loon calls, sometimes sets of 4 or 6. They're transcribed. All loon song is different. You can do a study of that as well, but I have my pattern that fits with his score that mimics a loon. And if I do it in different halls, it can sound more or less like a loon, depending on my pacing. So I will turn my head perhaps, or even if I stay still, I can control the speed of it to get that kind of acoustic feedback. But different lakes of different sizes require me to change just minutely to accommodate that. I can also adjust my production to accommodate the space, or my phrasing options. Accents can often catch a lake's reverb or the rock in a way that a more legato approach doesn't. I know that I suspect anyway that Ellen found this when she was working on the wolf music for flute, because I know that there's like a at the beginning of her abode, which would I know have caught that set the world ringing. I can find that with different kinds of articulations, staccati and accents. I can wake the lake. Resonator adjustments help as well. Originally, Schafer loves writing for the voice, but he wrote primarily for concert music for mezzos. He had mezzos in his life, and he also loved, I think, that warm color, the warm, rich voice. However, when he started writing music for outdoors, his preferred instrument shifted and he started to write for high soprano. Beautiful ringing coloratura, because he found that this voice caught the lake, like these high frequencies seem to be productive outside towards the sound ideal he was looking for. So again, in addition to just having the higher vocal quality, I can use brightness to catch that ring, to light up the lake. And so sometimes I'll find if I'm having a rough day, if it's windy in the morning or unpleasant. So I definitely come with a set of aesthetic values for this music. If I come and I find the lake is not accommodating that morning, I can usually edge it up with a little bit more brightness, a little more to the sound, a little more bite. That will be an experiment I would make. So I would like to talk about the aesthetic ideal and the relinquishment of it. So having spoken about coming in with these really strong ideas and experimenting with spaces, I also experiment with indoor spaces, and we can talk about that if there's time. But I think it's important to talk about what happens, as Ellen said, when you have to let it go. I think Emily also mentioned this. So Schafer had strong aesthetic ideals for the music. The performer, I have strong aesthetic ideals for the music. But in addition to using my faculties for listening very carefully and engaging with the space and with the feedback from the natural environment, be it animate or inanimate, we have a strong practice of humility in these outdoor works. In the Wolf Project, it's extreme because we must perform regardless of the weather. And, I've sung The Princess in a downpour, quasi-hurricane downpour. I have grabbed a canoe and jumped in because something went wrong and I need to get where I'm going and there's a lake in the way. So we have to really relinquish our comfort and our expectations in that project to an extreme degree, which I think creates resourceful, resilient musicians. It's really fun, and you learn a sense of adventure. But you also have to humble yourself in front of the performance space, in front of nature, before nature. It's difficult, it's challenging sometimes to sing in the morning or to sing in the cold. Ellen mentioned bringing in an instrument and having repairs, but there's nothing I can do for my voice. It is my voice. I don't want to hurt it, and I won't hurt it, but how can I prepare it? So I have my preparations and how I take care of my body in those spaces and how I prepare myself for singing early in the morning with no warm up, which is also an expectation. But I like to think of it as an improvisation. So the humility, the humble position in relationship to the space is one of an improviser. So I can't say no to my partner. I can only say yes and. It's liberating. And it was one of the goals of Schafer's outdoor writing. Having said that, I wanted to, like, the humility is a large element of it. I do feel like that humble relationship to your performance environment is actually very inspiring and beautiful and a wonderful contribution of these works in this aesthetic. But I have thought recently about a different way of thinking about it, in that you're bringing your sound out into this natural space and you're dominating it. There was discussion earlier about whether or not the animals liked that. I did have an experience where we did a show in the water. Myself and two other sopranos were singing, and it was in the context of the Wolf Project. We were singing in the water, and it was quite an exciting stage. It was like a big ball, very, very fun. But these three loons came to perhaps investigate. They sang with us. They contributed. And at the moment, it was thrilling and it was beautiful. And we improvised with them. It was amazing. In retrospect, were they frightened? There was a flaming ball on the water and we were making sounds. They may have been more concerned. So yeah, it's something to consider when we come out. The first time I heard Schafer's music outdoors was with Wendy Humphreys singing Sunfather in the morning in a campground area. And I was knocked off my feet, absolutely stunned at the acoustic dominance of that voice, the way that she took up so much space. I found it thrilling and exciting and wanted to do it myself and have. But I wonder, maybe that's part of the draw. Maybe we love to hear ourselves in a larger and larger space.
Brooke, thank you so much. I don't want to cut you off, but I do want to leave some time for discussion before lunch. So I'm really excited about this very detailed articulation of the performance practice demanded by this work. And I'd like to ask Emily to turn on her camera. And I'm gonna try removing your spotlights and see if I can get us all spotlit. Let me see if that works. If I do this, yes, it does. Okay. So we have a question in the chat from Santiago, who is asking, have you experimented with the sounds of extinct species? I suppose this is for you, Emily. It surprises me that the only recording we have of the extinct huia, a New Zealand bird, is of a Maori elder mimicking its call, and he gives a link where that can be heard. How do you deal with that idea of animal sounds that might not be available to you to hear?
Yeah, this is a good question. I know there have been some composers who've written pieces based on calls of extinct species, but I think it would be too poignant for me. I think I would just feel sort of emotionally torn up while I was doing it. So I don't think I could, at least right now, I don't see myself doing that. I don't think I've even used any sounds of, very endangered species, but I do sometimes I do think of, when I write music based on bird song, I'm never trying to transcribe it exactly because, we could go hear the bird or we could make a recording for that, but I'm sort of filtering it through my own imagination, or maybe presenting one aspect of the song while recognizing that I'm completely leaving out another aspect and adding things of my own. So I don't choose near extinct species, but I do hope that when I write pieces based in bird songs, they'll make people more curious about the actual song of that bird, and they'll become more curious about where it lives and maybe going out to hear it, or maybe doing what they can to preserve that land where that species lives. So I would say I tend to keep, I can tend to keep direct conservation messages at a little bit of a distance, but I hope it's sort of more through piquing people's interest in particular species that will maybe lead to conservation related things eventually.
Thank you for that. Again, everyone, please feel free to type your questions in the chat or to use the reaction button to raise your hand, which I think should put you into my view. Catherine Gendron asks, do you find that the sound changes greatly when viewers are present? The physical body is creating echoes, for example? If so, do you adjust when you hear these differences from when you rehearsed without listeners? It's a very good question, because in the concert hall, of course, as soon as you have a lot of people in the hall, the sound is very different. Brooke, what's your perspective on that?
I agree. Outdoors, they're not like the space is so vast that the impact is negligible. Indoors, yes. Indoors, there's a lot you can do. Yeah, with the concert hall, I do adjust in indoor space.
One of the things that I noticed when we recorded some of the instrumental music that has both real echoes and then instrumental echoes composed in, was that we would try to, maybe tune in advance. And there's no way we could tune to each other with any kind of accuracy in the cold and the dawn and the outdoors. But then we'd go some distance from one another, maybe over, maybe over 100 square feet or more. And we would, more than that, I'm not giving a very good figure here. And in the recording, all of those discrepancies in tuning would disappear. That somehow just that distance kind of evened things out so that it didn't sound as discordant as when we tuned. Emily, as a composer, how do you deal with the technical aspects? Is your work mainly meant to be performed in concert spaces, or do you conceive of works for outdoor spaces as well?
Yeah, I have, most of my works are for concert spaces, but I have some, the Obad that I wrote for you in 1995 or something, 97, I don't know. And another clarinet piece that I wrote for the Wolf Project, as well as some sort of simple chants for people to sing. And those I certainly, in both the clarinet and even more so the flute piece, I was sort of trying to take into account the idea that people would be playing it just after getting up without warming up. So they would need some long tones to get into it. And then more recently I wrote, not that recently, but in 2011, I wrote a piece for the Newfoundland Sound Symposium for Reed Trio, including Catherine Lee, who's part of the Wolf Project, and Alex Eastley and Louise Campbell and Dancer, which is performed at the Sound Symposium. And that actually did involve bird songs, but I wasn't trying to really interact with the birds that were there directly. I sort of gave I structured the piece around the 12 months of the year and looking at the different birds that would come and go from that spot. So it was sort of site specific, but not time specific. However, the piece had a lot of flexibility built into it. So for sure, like what Brooke was talking about, like if you play something and it causes a bird to come closer or to call or something like that, you want to be able to take the time to hear that and to see what's going on.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was going to say, again, it's not the case in all of my indoor pieces, but I think sometimes I still like that sense of listening in my indoor pieces, because even though concert halls are more uniform than outdoors, there's still a lot of variability in terms of how much space you need to let something resonate, or how much space, sometimes you want to wait until something becomes quiet, like completely silent, or sometimes you don't. And that's going to vary a lot depending on where you are.
Yeah. Do, do you both find, this is maybe just an idea of mine, but it's something you said, Emily, in your presentation really brought this up for me. And it's something that interested me about performing in And Wolf Shall Inherit the Moon over that week-long intergenerational professionals and amateurs, events that happen throughout the day in the form of rituals, really, rather than just concert stuff, right? And no audience except each other, right? So that I say, not for, we know this, but it's a strange project for folks who've never been there. So one of the things that really struck me about what you said was this idea of a kind of interdependence, where, obviously the person who can canoe really well is as important at the Wolf Project as the soprano, sorry. Yeah. And the soprano who can canoe is absolutely gold.
First time I took soprano, I made sure I dug a kaibo to prove I wasn't a princess.
A kaibo being a latrine outside. So I wonder if either of you would like to reflect on that notion. Does Schafer's music, or has Schafer's music influenced you in thinking about your relations, both with, obviously, with space and with sonic activity in space, but also with other elements? How has it changed the way that you think relationally, or has it?
Do you want to go first, or shall I?
You go first. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I was noticing and I only had 10 minutes to talk. And of course I could talk about Schafer and the Wolf Project for, 7 hours if I had 7 hours. But I noticed that in this, talk that I wrote, once I start talking about the Wolf Project, I don't actually talk about his music at all. Because for me, as much as I love Schafer's music and as much as pieces like his third string quartet just totally stunned me and had a huge formative effect on me, the most important thing about the Wolf Project wasn't Murray's music. It wasn't any of our music. It was the way we worked together to create the music. And it's funny because, I spend, if any of you are on Twitter, you'll see I spend too much time on Twitter, but you see classical musicians, sometimes they get into things about what's the greatest piece. But I feel like for me, the idea of what's the greatest thing is just so contextualized. You can't say this thing is great without looking at the context in which it's happening and who's listening and what else they've done that day and how they've created it. So I can think of somebody singing a chant out of tune that was as great for me as some of the great classical music experiences I've had, which have also been great, and all kinds of other music as well. But my primary experience is in classical music, or being trained as a classical musician. So yeah, that's one. I do feel like, relationships are as important or more important than what the ultimate sound is. I think that's just one thing.
Thank you.
I think collaboration is something that I've learned from that project, that the working together, and certainly from my initial experiences of it to later, I feel like I've gained a lot of collaborative skills and create openness.
Yeah. And certainly that issue of having to collaborate, again, in the context. You arrive at the site, and what sounded great last year, a beaver dam has been built, and so the water level is different, or there's windfalls, and there's a new kind of potential physical theater space opened up, or the trail is no longer viable, right? All of that stuff. Or it's super cold out those nights and you forgot to bring something warm enough, and so you're not getting enough sleep, or you're all of these kind of extra musical details. I think you're right, Emily. They really they really become part of both the creative practice, the co-creative practice, and the performance practice of being in that environment.